How many of you say down? About 50-50. We got 1/3 yes, 1/3 no, and 1/3 not voting. Okay. When we talk about asylum seekers in Europe, the high point of asylum seekers, in terms of applications, is 1992. It is not today. The high point in 1992 was 670,000 applications for 15 EU states. 2001, that had been reduced to 424,500 for the EU 27, and in 2009, 263,400. Right? It's reduced considerably. The funny thing is that when we talk about this Arab Spring, the images are very different from the reality. The images are Sarkozy and Berlusconi when we talk about migration. Sarkozy, first of all, you have Berlusconi going to Lampedusa in front of the press, trying to show his country overrun by Tunisians. 20,000 Tunisians arriving in a week, and he wants to show the world that we're going to give them residence permits, because temporary residence permits, forgive me, I'll get to that in a minute, but we're being overrun and we need help. Then you have Sarkozy saying, hey, you can't open the doors to Schengen like that. And so Sarkozy closes the French-Italian border symbolically, saying that Europe is being overrun and we have to protect ourselves. The truth is, Europe is managing its migration relatively well in this region if you take a look at the numbers. Right? If you take a look at the numbers, actually, when we talk about the EU, that we have two ways of measuring immigration. One is flows, meaning how many people come every year, and one is stock, how many people are really in the EU. The stock, right now, it sounds huge when you hear it. 31.8 million migrants in the European Union, right? How many people do we have in the European Union? 500 million. 6.4% of the population.
Secretariat.
We're talking about 6% of the population that is non-EU migrants. We're actually talking, when we discuss these 200 some thousand people seeking asylum, with only 25% getting a positive answer. Now, I'll tell you why I say 25% get a positive answer. Because of that, less than half get real refugee status. The other half get temporary refugee status or temporary residence, which goes up to 6 months or it can go up to a year. But the ones that actually are recognized as refugees are less than 12% of those that apply to the European Union. Because you have to show that you are in danger in order to get this status. And that means you can't say, I'm from Tunisia and there's violence. I'm from Libya and there's violence. You have to show, my name is, and in my town there is this, and as a result of this, I am threatened and therefore I should get asylum in the country where I'm applying. The other thing is you have to know the rules. If you arrive from Tunisia to Italy, and then pass from Italy to France, and then get asylum, you won't get asylum. Because you have to do it when you step foot in European Union soil. So the thing is that now when we talk about what's happening with Arab Spring, it's very interesting because of Berlusconi and Sarkozy, in my opinion. They wrote a letter to the European Union. They wrote it to the head of the European Commission and to the head of the Council. And the letter says, the EU has to ensure a strong and necessary extraordinary support to those countries, giving priority to those who have chosen the way of democracy. Okay? In exchange, we have the right to expect from our partner countries a commitment to a rapid and efficacious cooperation with the European Union and its member states in fighting illegal migration. So it's very interesting. Once again, you have this language where the European Union is supposed to, and I say supposed to because this is Berlusconi and Sarkozy, it's not the EU, but is supposed to promote democracy on one hand, but on the other hand, stop the flow of people into Europe. Now, I have to say that when we talk about this region of the Maghreb, one of the things that's very interesting now is this whole debate, which I think was quite, if not explicit, was implicitly in the images you showed about Islam. We're asking, is Islam compatible with democracy today? How many of you have heard of the Rerum Novarum? It's Latin. I don't know if you study Latin here or not, but the Rerum Novarum literally means new things. It was an encyclic from Pope Leo XIII in 1891. And it was very important because that was the first time the Catholic Church allowed practicing Catholics to participate in democracy. In 1900, in Europe and in the United States, we were asking ourselves, are Catholics compatible with democracy? And I just leave you with that, because I think it's very important to remember that this question about Islam and democracy is a question we've already asked with a different religion, which is our own for many of us here. And I would also like to remind you that when we talk about democracy, democracy is supposed to not just represent a system of interests. It's supposed to represent values. So a free trade agreement in North America, that's about interest. That's what the title says. A union in Europe based on values which have developed since the 1950s up till today through various treaties is supposed to show more, I think. And as a result, I want to just mention that of the 181,000 people who have fled Libya in the last few weeks, more than half of them are in Tunisia. Despite all the problems with a transition in Tunisia, Tunisia and Tunisians have opened their doors to these refugees. The European Union response has been the typical international response up until now. They paid 42 million euros to Tunisia. They did the same with Kosovo. They did the same with Bosnia. The idea is keep refugees as close to their homes as they can and do not let them pass on to European shores. And so therefore, this question of democracy, when we talk about relationships between continents, it's also a question of whether we're promoting values, not just whether we're promoting interests and systems. And with that, I thank you very much. I hope I didn't go over.
Pour cette présentation. Et donc, là aussi, vous avez 15 minutes pour les questions et pour les remarques.
En français, s'il vous plaît. Pas de problème.
Pourquoi il y avait autant d'immigrants en 1992?
Pardon, j'ai pas compris.
Why were there so many immigrants in 1992?
Okay. Now, excuse me, they weren't immigrants, they were refugees, asylum seekers. And so we're essentially talking about the breakup of the ex-Yugoslavia. En fait, quand la Yougoslavie s'est cassée. Oh, pardon, je répète en français la question. La question c'est pourquoi on a eu tellement de réfugiés en 1992. Et la réponse, c'était la période où on a la désintégration de l'ex-Yougoslavie, en fait. Oui?
Yeah. How is Europe supposed to handle all these immigrants? Like, if we would let all the migrants in our in the Union, like, how is Europe supposed to manage it?
No, en fait, I'll answer in. Let me translate quickly in French. I guess this is how we'll do this. This is the way we teach at the University of Luxembourg. We always translate questions. It's quite funny, actually, to see how it works with us. Okay, so, comment l'Europe peut faire une bonne gestion de tous ces immigrés qui vont arriver? Comment on peut assurer une qualité de vie, peut-être? C'est une bonne question. Okay, so the answer is going to be an opinion, nothing more. Okay? I mean, really, I actually have two lives as an academic. First, actually, was the study of the integration of migrants in Europe. And then the second is this comparative regional integration. And when we talk about the integration of migrants, one of the things that is often not seen or not proposed in migration debates is the fact that in many of the southern states, for example, where migrants are arriving, they're actually better integrated economically than native citizens. So I was doing studies in Spain and in Italy on the economic integration of migrants in different cities. And would you believe their unemployment rates were lower than the unemployment rates of the native population? And what I mean to say is, when you take a look at immigrants, the question is, are they actors or are they victims? When we talk about integration in the United States says everybody has freedom, and they also have the freedom to starve, citizen or non-citizen. There's no social state, there's no protectionism. So as a result, everybody, citizen and non-citizen, is seen as an actor who has to take control of their own destiny. In Europe, because there is a social state, oftentimes migrants are viewed as needing to be taken care of. And my opinion is that that's not the spirit with which most migrants come. And in fact, most of the anthropologists, sociologists who are speaking with migrants, as they arrive, find that they do have some resources, and they need resources because it takes 2,000. If you're coming from the Middle East, it takes minimum 2,000 euros to get to Europe, right? And then, if you're coming from Asia, it can take over 10,000 euros if you're going through smuggling raids. And so they have some money, and they have some education. And so I think, actually, that when we talk about migration, it's not just a question, right, of taking care of migrants. It's a question of creating a system in which they can essentially integrate themselves. And I will just say one quick word. This is actually where the European Union is going with its immigration policies. We forget this with immigration choisie, this language that Sarkozy is using to politicize. But the truth is, the European Union is actually going toward a system where migrants, they're trying to undo Fortress Europe, and they're trying to recruit migrants that can actually bring skills that the EU needs in many areas. Yeah.
I got a question. When is it legal to get into a country of the EU?
Oui, bonne question.
What is the system now?
Oui. Ok. La question, c'est comment on peut arriver en Europe légalement. Okay, I've done this 3 times now, because as I said, I was born in the US, I've lived more than half my life in Europe, and I have never, ever had European citizenship. I lived in Italy, then in France, and now Luxembourg. I've always had a US passport. So, what I have to do, taking a very personal test case, is write a letter. I first have to apply for a visa. Applying for a visa means that I have to convince the European Union that I should get into a country. In order for me to get the visa, I have to have a work permit. In order to get the work permit, I have to show that there's an employer who wants me. And then to justify my hiring at the University of Luxembourg, I had to write a letter which stated why there was no other political science in Luxembourg with my qualifications or my abilities, and why after Luxembourg, there was no other political scientist in all of the European Union with my qualifications or with my abilities in order to fill that position. And as crazy as it sounds, that was the letter that I had to write. I had to write essentially why I am special, more special than any European. It was a very flattering letter, by the way. Right? Now, the thing is, when we talk about getting into Europe legally, right, that is how you do it if you're an economic migrant, okay? If you have asylum, it's something very different. What you have to do is you have to show that you were threatened. You have to show, as soon as you arrive, you ask for asylum, and you don't show how you have skills that Europe needs. You show how the situation where you come from has directly affected your life. Now this is where, when I mentioned the ex-Yugoslavia. Do you know how much difficulty citizens of the ex-Yugoslavia had because as they were leaving their countries, essentially, their passports were taken away. Or those who had a passport had a Yugoslav passport, and that country didn't exist anymore. It became very difficult for them to show. There's also a whole group of people doing interesting research, in my opinion, who are psychologists and psychiatrists. Because oftentimes when you go and you want to show that you are justified in seeking asylum, you're in front of a judge, you're in front of the police, And these psychiatrists and these psychologists are doing research because they say people fear judges and police because that's who was torturing them in their home country. And they don't tell their story for that reason. And then their cases get refused and they have the right to appeal, but when they appeal, they have to justify they have to justify why their story changed. And then they get accused of lying. And then after that, the process goes on and on and on. It's very difficult to deal with these intangibles. I'm not vilifying Europe, by the way, or any other country. When I want to make that very clear. You can't get into somebody's head. That's just impossible when you're dealing with law, right? And you need laws to regulate things. But these are the problems with the system, for sure. And when we talk, for example, about economic migrants, as I said, I have to get a visa and a work permit, but I essentially need an employer before I do that. It's very difficult to get onto the continent without the employer, first. And then you get lots of political debates about regularizations of positions. Italy and Spain, for example, have had mass regularizations, where they said if you can show you've been on Italian or Spanish soil for 10 years or 5 years, depending on which campaign, that we will regularize the first 300,000, right? Immediately, other countries, specifically the UK, got very upset about that. And so, to get onto the soil, it really just means the visa is the key, formally, but truthfully, the job is the key.
Why are Sarkozy and Berlusconi so afraid of immigrants?
Afraid, I don't think is the exact word. I think that they instrumentalize immigration very well. I mean, you should know, by the way, Berlusconi is in a coalition. Unlike Sarkozy, who's directly elected, Berlusconi's not a president. He's a prime minister. He's really the president of the council is his title. But he's in a coalition with radical right parties. So with the Italian equivalent of the Front National, right? He has to cater to them. And in fact, when the violence erupted in Libya, his Minister of the Interior, who's a member of the radical right party, came out in front of Europe and said, we need your help, we need your investment. There are 1.5 million people in Libya about to invade Italy. You know, he got that number because there are 1.5 million Africans living in Libya. So he just took that statistic and said that they are going to come into Italy. Berlusconi has to cover his own coalition bases as well. He needs that party right now desperately. So that's one of the reasons he does it. The other reason I think, if I can be said, I'm going to give you a bit of an opinion. It's not so academic. He's got lots of judicial problems at the moment, and I think he's very happy to find other issues for people to talk about. As for Sarkozy, you should remember that the French center-right orchestrated an election very, very well in 2000. I think it was 2000, when they got, for the second round of the presidency with Chirac, Le Pen, and not Jospin. 2002, thank you, forgive me. So 2002. They orchestrated that very well. Public security in France gets votes, and they know that. And Sarkozy used that very effectively. Remember the 2005 riots in France? I'm not blaming Sarkozy for these riots at all. I mean, actually, it's funny. I published actually on this because I was living in France at the time about why you had essentially riots that erupted throughout the country. But the truth is, Sarkozy did not do anything to quell those riots. He also actually instigated a lot of anger through comments that were offensive comments. He doesn't worry about the votes in those neighborhoods. He knows that he gets votes by dealing with public security. Listen, in France, public security has been an electoral issue domestically. In the US, it was terrorism. Different language, but it's on the agendas today. Today, when we deal with migration, it's linked to security throughout the world. Even in Libya, by the way. You should know that Libya, because Gaddafi got ostracized by the international community due to support for terrorism, and Libya was suffering from an arms embargo for 18 years. He was very unhappy with the lack of support from other Arab states. So he created this Pan-African identity for Libya. And by becoming Pan-African, he recruited 1.5 million Africans to come to Libya. And then after that, there was a backlash amongst Libyans. And now Gaddafi, in order to appease the Italians and to appease his own people, has actually begun deporting migrants and starting this radical right campaign against migrants in Libya. Well, not these days. These days he has bigger problems. But this is what was happening right up until the revolution/civil war. So I mean, this is something that's happening everywhere.